June 19, 1942. Achnacarry Castle, the Scottish Highlands. 200 American soldiers have arrived at the most brutal military training facility in the world, and the British commandos watching them climb off their lorries in the Lochaber rain, watching them take in the graves visible from the road, and the obstacle courses visible from the gate, and the instructors whose expressions convey nothing warmer than professional evaluation, are waiting to see how long it takes before the first one quits. Achnacarry Castle is not what its name suggests to a soldier who is arriving at a training facility and has been told that the training facility is a castle. The castle itself, an imposing Victorian pile in Lochaber in the Western Highlands of Scotland, belongs to the Cameron family and has been requisitioned for the duration of the war as the home of the Commando Basic Training Centre, whose commanding officer is Colonel Charles Vaughan, a man whose military bearing, erect, compact, projecting through its physical expression the specific quality of controlled intensity that 30 years of military service have built in a man who has been preparing himself for the instruction of soldiers his entire professional life, and whose personal history of combat in the First World War and in Palestine give him an authority over the training program that is absolute and that he applies without compromise to every man who arrives at Achnacarry, regardless of rank, nationality, or prior service. The training that Vaughan has designed and implemented at Achnacarry is not the training of any conventional military force. It is training specifically designed to produce a human being who, under conditions of physical exhaustion, psychological stress, and operational danger that exceeds anything the training itself can fully simulate, continues to function, continues to think, to lead, to make decisions, and to fight, in the specific and sustained way that the commandos' assigned missions require. Men die during Achnacarry training. The live-fire exercises that characterize the Achnacarry course, where the machine gun rounds passing 2 feet over the crawling trainees are real rounds and not blanks, where the charges detonating 20 meters from the running men are real explosive charges and not theatrical props, where the water obstacles that must be crossed in full combat equipment include the possibility of drowning as a real, rather than a simulated risk for men who enter the water before they have learned the specific and critical technique for crossing water obstacles in full military kit, produce the specific and occasional result that training designed to operate at the limit of human physical and psychological capacity produces. Men are killed. The graves of those who have died in training accidents are visible on the approach road to the castle, visible by specific design, because Colonel Vaughan believes that a man who has been reminded during his approach march that the training he is about to undergo has killed people is a man whose subsequent performance on the assault courses will reflect that knowledge in ways that improve the quality of the training by ensuring that the trainee approaches every element of it with the seriousness that an activity that can kill deserves. The American soldiers arriving on June 19 are the first contingent of what will become the 1st Ranger Battalion. 600 volunteers, the selected remnant of approximately 2,000 applicants drawn from American units already in Britain, men who have heard that something called the Rangers is being formed and who have put their names forward for the specific and self-aware reason that men who volunteer for the hardest available assignment put their names forward because they believe they can do it and because the doing of it matters to them in the specific and personal way that choosing the hard thing matters to the people who make that choice. They are drawn from American units already in Britain who have been selected through a competitive process conducted at Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, that has evaluated approximately 2,000 applicants and has rejected the majority of them through the specific and sequential elimination of men who are physically incapable of the march standards, men who are medically disqualified by the examination process, and men who are assessed by the selection cadre as psychologically unsuited to the specific combination of individual hardship tolerance and unit cohesion that commando and ranger operations require. The men who have survived the selection process believe, on the strength of that survival, that they are physically and mentally prepared for what Achnacarry will require of them. No one who arrives at Achnacarry for the first time is prepared. regardless of the prior athletic achievement, or the military experience, or the competitive selection process that has convinced the arriving man that he is among the best available candidates for this training. The preparation for Achnacarry is Achnacarry itself, and the gap between the preparation men bring with them and the preparation the castle produces is the first and most important lesson of the training, a lesson delivered in the first week by the speed marches and the assault courses and the river crossings and the live fire exercises that the training schedule administers with the relentless and impersonal thoroughness of a system designed to sort the men who can be made into commandos from the men who cannot, at the pace and the intensity that the operational requirement specifies, rather than at the pace and intensity that the trainee's comfort allows. Lieutenant Colonel William Orlando Darby, commanding the American contingent, has not arrived with illusions about his men's readiness. He has arrived with the specific and professional intention of using Achnacarry to create from the raw material of American military volunteers a force that can operate alongside the commandos, and eventually independently of them, at the standard that the commandos' combat experience has demonstrated is the minimum necessary for the kind of operations both formations are being designed to conduct. What the British commandos who observe that first American training contingent write and say about what they see, and what the assessment evolves into over the weeks of shared training, becomes one of the most revealing professional evaluations of American military training philosophy that the Second World War's Anglo-American partnership produces. The British Commando assessment of the American Rangers begins in June 1942 with the specific skepticism that the commandos bring to any new trainee population at Achnacarry. The professional wariness of men who have been through the training themselves and who understand from their own experience how much of what men believe about their own physical and mental capability is wrong in ways that the training will systematically expose. The commandos who serve as instructors and observers at Achnacarry have seen many men arrive confident and leave, either as commandos, transformed by the training, or as men returned to their original units after failing to meet the standard. They have seen specific national contingents of Allied troops go through the training, and they have formed, from that experience, specific professional assessments of what different national military training systems produce in the soldiers who arrive from them. What distinguishes the American Rangers from the beginning is not what they can do. In the first days of training, many of them cannot do what the Achnacarry standard requires, but what they appear to understand about the gap between what they can do and what the training will demand of them. British military culture, the commandos have observed, produces soldiers who are good at concealing the gap and poor at acknowledging it. The specific tradition of the British soldier, who never admits distress, has tactical advantages and training disadvantages. The American soldiers who arrive at Achnacarry in June 1942 have, in the observation of the British instructors, the specific quality of being honest about their difficulty in a way that the instructors find paradoxically more useful than the stoic concealment that other national contingents often produce. A man who tells you he cannot complete the obstacle course at the required pace gives you actionable information about where the training program needs to focus its attention. A man who completes the obstacle course by concealing his difficulty with the specific technique of the practiced sufferer does not. The Rangers are not, in those first days, completing everything at the required standard, but they are transparent about what they cannot do, and they are returning to do it again in a way that the British instructors recognize as the specific quality of the man who will eventually achieve the standard, rather than the man who will eventually fail it and be returned to his unit. William Darby is 31 years old when he arrives at Achnacarry in June 1942, young for the command of a battalion, younger still in the accumulated combat experience that the commando officers surrounding him have built through 2 years of the war's most demanding raids and operations, and aware of both these facts in the specific and professionally honest way of a commander, who understands that the gap between his preparation and the preparation of the men he will be compared against is a gap he must address through the quality of his command, rather than through the accumulated experience he does not yet possess. He is a West Point graduate of the class of 1933 and has spent the intervening 9 years in the kind of peacetime military assignments, field artillery units, staff positions, the specific and valuable but operationally untested development of the administrative and organizational skills that professional military assignments outside combat produce, that have developed in him the organizational capability and the command presence that the Ranger Project requires, and that have not given him the specific operational experience that the commando officers who are evaluating his unit possess in abundance. What Dieppe brings to Achnacarry that the commando evaluators note, and note with a professional respect that the subsequent training record will deepen into genuine admiration, is a specific approach to command that the British military's own tradition has produced in its best officers, and that Dieppe demonstrates with a consistency that marks it as characteristic rather than occasional. He does the training with his men. Not a modified version, not a command inspection of the training his men are undergoing. The training. When the Rangers run the speed marches, Dieppe runs them. When the Rangers conduct the opposed river crossings under simulated fire, Dieppe crosses. When the Rangers climb the obstacle courses, whose completion times the commando standard prescribes, Dieppe climbs them. This is not theatre in the sense that Patton's frontline presence was sometimes described as theatre. Dieppe's physical participation in the Achnacarry training is the operational expression of the command philosophy that he has brought to the Ranger Project from the beginning. That the standard he is asking his men to meet is a standard he will not ask them to meet unless he can meet it himself. The British commandos who observed Dieppe running the speed marches in the Scottish rain with his men, in conditions that the men themselves are finding at the limit of their physical resources, do not describe this observation in the language of admiration. They describe it in the language of recognition. Recognition of a commander who understands that the specific kind of unit he is trying to build is built by the commander's willingness to be the first manifestation of the standard rather than the observer of its application. July 1942. The Achnacarry training reaches its most demanding phase, and the Rangers who have survived the first 3 weeks are beginning to demonstrate the specific quality that the British instructors have been waiting for. The ability to perform at the required standard, not under fresh start conditions, but under the accumulated fatigue of continuous training that has not allowed recovery between demands. The assault courses at Achnacarry are not designed to test a man's capability when he is rested and fed and in possession of the full physical and psychological resources that rest and food provide. They are designed to test his capability at the end of a speed march that has already consumed most of what he has, in weather that the Scottish Highlands reliably provide in any season and that the training schedule does not adjust for, because the operational situations for which the training is preparing do not adjust for weather, under the observation of instructors who are watching not for the completion of the specific task, the climbing, the swimming, the crawling under fire, the explosive breach of the obstacle, but for the quality of the performance under the conditions of its completion, the decision-making, the leadership expression, the help given to the man next to him without being asked, the continuation of the task after the conditions have made continuation the harder choice. A ranger who completes the assault course in regulation time after a 5-mile speed march over highland terrain in rain that has been falling since before dawn is demonstrating something that no amount of isolated technical competence can replace. The specific integration of physical capability, technical skill, and mental resilience that produces, under operational conditions, the kind of sustained effective action that the Commando and Ranger mission requires. By mid-July 1942, after 4 weeks of training that has produced in the surviving Rangers the specific and visible transformation that Vaughan's program is designed to produce, the transformation from men who are physically capable of difficult tasks to men who are capable of difficult tasks under the conditions of maximum fatigue, maximum stress, and maximum operational pressure that the training has been systematically building toward. The commando instructors are filing assessments of the American Rangers that depart from the initial skepticism in specific and documented ways. The Americans, the assessments note, are learning faster than the instructors had projected. Not merely improving in the sense of physical conditioning responding to the demands of the training, that improvement is expected, is the planned output of the training's physical curriculum, and is not by itself the characteristic that the instructors are measuring. Learning in the specific and operationally relevant sense that their performance improvements outpace the physical conditioning that the training is producing and reflect the specific quality of cognitive adaptability that the instructors identify as the characteristic that separates the men who will become effective commandos from the men who will be returned to their units. The men who are returned to their units are returned not because they cannot complete the physical tasks, but because they cannot sustain the integration of physical performance with tactical judgment and leadership presence that the commando standard requires. The man who completes the obstacle course in the regulation time, but who, in the process, loses awareness of the men on either side of him and their needs, is returned. The man who makes time and maintains situational awareness and finds a way to help the man on his left who is struggling with the water obstacle, that man advances. The assessments also note something that the instructors did not expect, and that Vaughan himself notes in his personal assessment of the Ranger program that he submits to Combined Operations Headquarters in August 1942. The Rangers are developing, under Derby's command climate, a specific unit cohesion that the commando training is designed to produce, and that normally requires more time and more training to establish than the 4-week Achnacarry course provides. They are developing it faster than the British commando formation, in the equivalent stage of its training cycle, and the instructors attribute the faster development to something specific about the Ranger selection process, the self-selection of volunteers who have chosen the hardest available assignment, which produces in the selected unit a pre-existing commonality of self-conception that the training then develops into unit identity, and something specific about Derby's command approach that is producing in the unit a shared identity whose formation the training has accelerated rather than created from scratch. The unit cohesion that Achnacarry produces in the Rangers in 1942 is the unit cohesion that will take the 1st Ranger Battalion through Arzew in November 1942, through Tunisia and Sicily and Italy, through the expansion of the Ranger Force to 6 battalions, and through Cisterna in January 1944. The last a demonstration that unit cohesion and individual courage, however exceptional, cannot compensate for operational planning that has committed men to an impossible situation. The near failure that comes closest to ending the Ranger project before it produces its first operational result arrives not in the training, but in the operational planning that follows it. The 1st Ranger Battalion, its Achnacarry training complete, is assigned to participate in the Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942. The large-scale British-Canadian assault on the French coastal town that represents the first major Allied amphibious operation against the European continent, and that will become, in the subsequent weeks of operational analysis, one of the most costly and most instructive failures of the war. The Rangers assigned to Dieppe, 50 officers and enlisted men distributed among British and Canadian units as observers, with a small number in actual combat roles, are a fraction of the battalion's strength, specifically because the operational planning for Dieppe has not envisioned the Rangers as an independent assault force. What they experience at Dieppe, the specific horror of an amphibious assault against prepared beach defenses, in which the preliminary naval and air bombardment has not suppressed the German defenders, who emerge intact from their positions as the first landing craft ground on the beach, and in which the landing craft timing and the tank landing coordination and the fire support plan have all been compromised by the tactical confusion of an operation that has been planned and replanned, and that arrives at its execution with the specific and compounded consequences of insufficient preparation and insufficient deception, is not the Ranger experience of Dieppe. It is the experience of 6,000 Canadians and commandos who are killed, wounded, or captured in 9 hours of fighting against positions that the operational planning had assessed as suppressed, and that the operational execution demonstrates were not suppressed and cannot be taken by the forces committed. 3,367 of the 6,086 Canadians who land at Dieppe are killed, wounded, or captured. The commandos attached to the Dieppe force lose more than half of their committed strength. The Rangers who are present suffer 1 killed and 8 wounded. Minimal casualties compared to the formations they are attached to, and casualties produced by the same German fire that is producing the larger formation's catastrophic losses. The Rangers who are present absorb this experience with the specific quality that the Achnacarry training has been designed to produce. They continue to function, continue to perform their assigned roles, and return from Dieppe with the operational knowledge of what an amphibious assault against a prepared enemy position actually looks like, that no training exercise at Achnacarry had fully simulated. The Dieppe disaster is, for the Rangers who survive it, the specific and irreplaceable final examination of the training program. The examination whose curriculum is the actual battle, and whose passing grade is survival and continued effective action in conditions that the training had prepared them for in principle, and that Dieppe delivers in the specific, visceral, and indelible form of actual combat. November 8, 1942. The Rangers land at Arzew in darkness, preceding the main American amphibious force of Operation Torch by the precise interval that the operational plan has specified, and that the British Combined Operations Headquarters has been insisting on as the minimum required for the fort seizure mission to accomplish its purpose before the main force's landing craft reach the beach defenses that the forts are currently positioned to devastate. The specific assignment is the seizure of Fort du Nord and Fort de la Pointe, the 2 harbor fortifications whose French defensive batteries can cover the Arzew landing beaches, with a fire that the operational planning has identified as potentially decisive in either direction. Decisive if the Rangers take the fort silently before the main landing alerts the defenders, or decisive in the opposite direction if the forts are manned and firing when the landing craft come in. The assignment is the first independent Ranger combat mission of the war, and its execution, the silent approach in rubber boats from the transport ships, the landing on the beach below the cliffs in darkness without detection, the scaling of the cliffs using the cliff assault techniques that Achnacarry's training regime has drilled into every man who completed the course, and the final assault on the fortified positions in darkness using the combined fire and movement that is the fundamental tactical skill the Achnacarry course produces, is the operational validation of everything that the Achnacarry training was designed to produce. The Rangers take both forts before the main landing force reaches the beaches. The Arzew operation costs the Rangers 1 man killed and 1 wounded, against a French garrison that outnumbers them, that has been equipped and positioned specifically to defend this harbor, and that is not prepared for the approach from the cliff above the beach, that the Rangers have executed in darkness with the combination of speed and silence that the Achnacarry training has produced in men who have spent 12 weeks being taught that surprise and tempo are the commando's primary weapons, and that the tactical situation which surprise and tempo create in the opponent's command and decision-making system is the commando's primary objective. The surprise is complete. The tempo is overwhelming. The garrison surrenders before it has organized the resistance that its numbers and its position would have permitted if the Rangers had approached from the expected direction at the expected pace. The British commando officers who receive the operational reports of the Arzew engagement describe it, in the assessments they file with Special Operations Executive and Combined Operations Headquarters, with the language of professional confirmation, what the training had projected the Rangers would be capable of in an independent operation of this kind, the operation has confirmed. The Ranger is not an American imitation of the British commando. He is, in the British assessment's specific formulation, something different. A man trained in the same school, to the same standard, but in a way that incorporates the specific qualities that the American military selection process and Darby's command philosophy have produced in him, and that make his combination of individual capability and unit cohesion as effective as the commando's own, and in specific respects, differently effective. Less deferential to conventional tactical boundaries, in the specific way that a military culture, less shaped by the class constraints of British military tradition, can produce, and more explicitly aggressive in the initial assault phase, in the specific way that men who have absorbed Darby's command philosophy understand the assault phase to require. By the time of the Sicilian campaign in July and August 1943, and the Italian campaign that follows it, the Ranger battalions, expanded to 6 battalions by the needs of the Mediterranean theatre, have accumulated an operational record whose specific performance data the British Commando Organisation examines in its own after-action analyses with the interest of a professional peer evaluating an Allied formation's combat history. The Rangers have fought at El Guitar in March 1943, where Darby's force conducted an assault march of 12 miles at night, followed by a dawn attack on the heights above the Jebel El Ankh Pass that achieved complete surprise. They have fought at Gela in Sicily in July 1943, where the 1st and 4th Ranger battalions landed ahead of the main American force and seized the port in fighting that cost both sides casualties at rates that validate the assault unit's traditional advantage in close combat against a defender who has not had time to organize a coherent defense. They have fought at Cisterna in Italy in January 1944, where the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions walk into a German ambush in circumstances that kill or capture 750 of the 767 men who enter the engagement, and that produce the specific military disaster that the Ranger force has not previously suffered, and whose analysis will reveal the precise conditions under which the qualities that Achnacarry produces are not sufficient to overcome the specific combination of intelligence failure and command decision that Cisterna represents. The Cisterna disaster does not reduce the British Commando assessment of the Ranger training system or of the Ranger as a military formation. It illustrates the specific operational limits of any elite assault unit committed to conditions, exposed, encircled, without fire support, against an opponent who has had time to prepare the specific anti-infiltration measures that a German force defending a main supply route would inevitably establish, that its specific training and equipment cannot compensate for. Darby's Rangers at Cisterna are not the force that Colonel Hutchins and the British Commando assessment have been describing since Arzew. They are the same men, with the same training, in a situation that the training's designers understood would produce casualties that the training cannot prevent. The commandos themselves have been committed to operations that their training could not fully compensate for. Dieppe is the most famous example, a commando and Canadian Army operation whose planning has committed elite soldiers to a defended beach in daylight, with the specific and foreseeable consequences of that commitment. Consequences whose documentary record in the casualty returns of August 19, 1942, the British military's operational evaluation has been processing into the doctrine that subsequent commando operations have applied. The Rangers' failure at Cisterna is not a failure of the training that Achnacarry produced. It is the failure of the operational planning that produced Cisterna, and the commando assessment makes this distinction with the professional precision of an organization that understands the difference between the limits of men and the limits of the plans that commit men to situations that exceed those limits. The legacy of what British commandos said about American Rangers, preserved in the operational assessments of Combined Operations Headquarters, in the personal accounts of British officers who served as Achnacarry instructors and who worked alongside Ranger units in the North Africa and Italy campaigns, in the formal assessments that the British Army's training evaluation system produced about the Ranger units it had observed in training and in combat, and in the professional literature of the special operations community that the Second World War created and that the subsequent decades have built on in the development of the American Special Forces and the British SAS and the NATO Special Operations capability, whose foundations were laid in the shared development of Commando and Ranger doctrine, is not primarily a statement about American military superiority or about the specific quality of the Ranger training program as compared with the Commando program that produced it. The two programs were, by design, producing the same capability from different raw materials. The British Commando program, drawing from the British Army's existing regular and territorial formations, and from the specific cultural tradition of a military force whose professional heritage includes the long-range desert group and the SAS's earliest desert operations, and the American Ranger program drawing from the American Army's volunteer population of men who have come forward from the specific and democratic tradition of the citizen soldier, whose military service is a choice freely made rather than a conscripted obligation, a tradition whose specific operational consequences for the Rangers' combat psychology the Achnacarry instructors have been noting since the first American volunteers arrived in Scotland in 1942. The assessment that British commandos made of the Rangers was the assessment of one version of a shared project evaluating another version of the same project, the project of taking ordinary men and making them into something that ordinary military training does not produce. What the British commandos said about this project, in the private conversations between Vaughan's instructors and the American officers who were watching the Ranger training develop over the summer and autumn of 1942, in the operational assessments that the Achnacarry staff produced after the first Ranger classes had completed the course, and whose conclusions Vaughan transmitted to Combined Operations Headquarters with his characteristic directness, in the post-Arzew and post-Dieppe comparative analyses that British Special Service officers produced for Combined Operations, and that eventually reached the desks of the American officers planning the later Ranger expansions, about the Rangers' training at Achnacarry, about Darby's command philosophy, about the specific combination of American individual initiative and British commando doctrine that the Ranger program created, was that the combination worked, that it produced a man who could do what the commando could do and who did some of it differently in ways that reflected something about the American military experience and the American military character that the British training had not produced in British soldiers, and that the difference, not better, not worse, but different in specific and operationally significant ways, was worth studying by anyone who intended to understand what it actually takes to build a military formation capable of doing the things that commando and Ranger operations require. Going in first, going in harder, going in against positions that conventional infantry cannot take, and doing it at night, in rain, after a march that has consumed most of what the men have, against an enemy who is ready for them, because the men who are doing it have been trained to a standard that makes the doing of it possible, even when the conditions that make it possible are the conditions of its maximum difficulty. The British Commando Program and the American Ranger Program represent, in the history of the Second World War, the specific moment when two democratic military traditions, both built on the proposition that volunteers who choose the hardest training are capable of achieving what conscripts committed to standard training cannot, both built on the specific and functional insight that the individual's freely chosen commitment to extreme difficulty is a more reliable military resource than the compelled commitment to ordinary training, recognized each other across the difference of national culture and military tradition, and built from that recognition the shared professional standard that Achnacarry represented. The Rangers who graduated from Achnacarry were American soldiers who had been trained by British commandos in the most demanding training program that the Second World War's Allied military establishment had produced. And what the British commandos who trained them said about them was that they had learned the lesson correctly and added something to it that the British tradition alone had not produced. The American something, the initiative, the self-reliance, the democratic individual's specific relationship to chosen hardship was what Achnacarry added to the commando doctrine to produce the Ranger. And the Ranger was, in the British Commando's professional assessment, a better version of something both traditions had been trying to build.